In 1774, Frederick the Great of Prussia ordered his officials to distribute free potatoes to the starving peasants of Kolberg. The peasants refused them. Not because they were not hungry. They were hungry. A combination of war devastation and harvest failure had left the region in genuine crisis. The kind of food scarcity that kills the very young and the very old first, and works methodically through everyone else. They had every rational incentive to accept food that was being offered to them at no cost by their own government. They refused because they believed, with complete sincerity, that the potato would kill them. Not through starvation, through something worse. Through the specific, documented, theologically certified mechanism by which the devil introduced corruption into the human body. Through food that grew in darkness, underground, away from the light of God and the sanctifying influence of the sun, that bore no mention in the Bible, that arrived in Europe from a pagan civilization at the end of the world, and that produced, in the people who ate it, a catalogue of symptoms that every physician in 16th and 17th century Europe had independently identified and every clergyman had independently confirmed. Leprosy, syphilis, fever, moral corruption. From a potato. Frederick the Great, facing a starving population that would rather remain hungry than eat the food he was providing, did something that no subsequent historian of agricultural policy has ever quite found the right word for. He stationed soldiers around the potato fields his officials had planted, not to protect the potatoes from theft, to make the peasants think the potatoes were worth stealing. It worked. But the story of how a vegetable became theologically dangerous, legally prohibited, and medically condemned across half of Europe for 2 centuries, and how one of the most consequential agricultural revolutions in the history of human civilization had to be accomplished through a combination of royal deception and peasant curiosity, begins not in Prussia and not with Frederick. It begins with a ship, and a civilization that the people on that ship were in the process of destroying. The potato, Solanum tuberosum, is not a European plant. It did not exist in Europe, Asia, Africa, or any part of the world outside the Andes mountain range of South America until 1532. For the preceding 8,000 years of its cultivation by the civilizations of the Andean highlands, the Inca, and the cultures that preceded them, it existed in a botanical isolation as complete as if it had evolved on a separate planet. The Andean civilizations had done something with the potato that no European agricultural tradition had come close to achieving with any crop. They had industrialized it. At altitudes above 4,000 meters, where maize will not grow, where quinoa struggles, where the thin cold air makes most of European agricultural knowledge irrelevant, the Andean peoples had developed over 3,000 varieties of potato adapted to specific microclimates, specific soil conditions, specific culinary purposes. 3,000 varieties. The potato was not a single crop in the Andean agricultural system. It was an entire agricultural vocabulary, a range of flavors, textures, storage characteristics, and nutritional profiles so broad that it constituted, by itself, most of what a highland Andean community needed to survive at altitude. They had also developed a food preservation technology, chuño, that solved the potato's single most significant practical limitation. Chuño was produced by exposing potatoes to the extreme overnight freeze of high-altitude Andean nights, then allowing them to thaw and dry in the daytime sun, then treading them to expel moisture, then repeating the process over several days until the potato had been reduced to a light, dry, almost indefinitely storable product that could be reconstituted with water months or years later. Freeze-dried food, developed in the Andes, approximately 2,000 years before Clarence Birdseye invented the commercial frozen food industry in 1924. This is the agricultural system that Francisco Pizarro's expedition encountered when it arrived in Peru in 1532, and this is the crop that the surviving members of that expedition carried back to Europe, along with the gold, the silver, and the political consequences of having destroyed one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. The potato arrived in Europe as an afterthought, a curiosity, a botanical specimen from the edge of the known world. It was about to become the most controversial vegetable on Earth. The European reception of the potato between 1570 and 1770 is one of the most comprehensively wrong responses to a beneficial technology in recorded history. The wrongness was systematic. It proceeded from botany to theology to medicine to law, and managed to be incorrect at every stage, without any single institution recognizing that the errors of the previous stage should have suggested more caution about the conclusions of the current one. It began with botany. The potato belongs to the family Solanaceae, the nightshade family. Its European relatives include deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and jimsonweed. These are, without exception, toxic plants. Several of them are hallucinogenic. Several of them are fatal in sufficient doses. All of them had been known to European herbalists for centuries as plants to be handled with caution and consumed never. The potato's botanical family membership was not a minor taxonomic detail. In the herbal tradition that governed European understanding of plant properties in the 16th century, family membership was destiny. A plant that was related to deadly nightshade was, by the logical framework of the era, presumptively toxic, and the burden of proof required to overcome that presumption was higher than any amount of observational evidence from Peru was going to satisfy. The Andean peoples had been eating it for 8,000 years without apparent harm. European herbalists reviewed this evidence and concluded that the Andean peoples were simply more resistant to its toxic properties than Europeans would be. This conclusion, that the evidence from the people who had been successfully eating the plant for 8 millennia was inapplicable to the people who had not tried it yet, is a masterpiece of confirmation bias so complete that it should be studied in epistemology courses. It was not an unusual conclusion for the era. It was the standard methodology. Then theology got involved. The Bible does not mention potatoes. This is not a surprising omission. The Bible was compiled in a part of the world where potatoes did not exist, several thousand years before the first European knew the Americas were there. But in the intellectual framework of 16th and 17th century European Christianity, the absence of a plant from Scripture was not a neutral fact. It was evidence. If God had intended human beings to eat potatoes, the argument ran, he would have mentioned them. The crops named in Scripture, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, olives, were the crops God had sanctioned. A plant from an uncharted continent, arriving with the conquerors of a pagan civilization, bearing botanical kinship with plants associated with witchcraft and poison, growing in the dark earth like a thing that preferred to avoid the light. This was not difficult theological territory to navigate, if you were looking for a conclusion. The potato grew underground. Medieval Europeans believed that plants growing underground, hidden from sunlight, were associated with decay, darkness, and the underworld. Since potatoes grew buried beneath the soil, unlike wheat or fruit that reached toward the sun, they became easy targets for religious suspicion. Combined with their absence from the Bible and their connection to poisonous nightshades, many clergy concluded they were not God's food but the devil's. Underground was where things that avoided God's sunlight went. Underground was associated, in the theological imagination of the era, with a specific other power whose interest in human dietary choices was well documented and consistently malign. The name Devil's Apple was not invented by credulous peasants. It appeared in official church documents, in published theological tracts, in the written opinions of clergymen whose institutional authority made their conclusions the operating framework for the populations they served. In Burgundy, clerical authorities formally prohibited potato cultivation because the plant caused leprosy. In Scotland, the General Assembly of the Church declared the potato unchristian because it was not mentioned in the Bible. In Russia, the Orthodox Church condemned it for decades. These were not fringe opinions. They were the mainstream institutional position of major religious organizations across the most powerful civilization on Earth. The potato did not cause leprosy. It did not cause syphilis. It did not cause moral corruption or spiritual contamination or any of the other conditions attributed to it in the official documents of the era. But in a world where institutional authority was the operating framework for most people's understanding of reality, The institutional position was reality. And the institutional position was, do not eat the potato. The medical establishment managed to be simultaneously more sophisticated and more wrong than the theologians. Physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries operated within the Galenic humoral framework, the same theoretical system responsible for bleeding Washington to death, for laudable pus, for most of the medical catastrophes documented in this series. Within that framework, foods were evaluated for their effects on the body's humoral balance, their tendency to produce excess heat, cold, moisture, or dryness in the patient who consumed them. The potato, starchy, dense, grown in cold, wet earth, was classified as cold and moist. Cold and moist foods, in the Galenic system, were associated with phlegm. Excess phlegm was associated with lethargy, poor digestion, and susceptibility to disease. The physician's objection to the potato was not superstition. It was applied science, incorrect science, built on a theoretical framework that was wrong at its foundations, but applied with internal consistency and professional sincerity. The result was the same as the theological objection: do not eat the potato. In France, the medical faculty of the University of Paris issued a formal opinion against potato consumption in 1630, citing its humoral properties and its suspected role in the spread of leprosy. The University of Paris, a formal faculty opinion, against a vegetable. This opinion remained the official position of French medical authority for over 100 years. The rehabilitation of the potato in Europe was not accomplished by science. It was not accomplished by theology revising its position. It was not accomplished by the medical faculty of Paris reconsidering its humoral analysis. It was accomplished by hunger, and by one man who understood, with extraordinary clarity, that the way to overcome 2 centuries of institutional resistance to a beneficial food was not to argue with the institutions. It was to make the food desirable. Antoine Augustin Parmentier was a French pharmacist and nutritionist who had been captured by Prussian forces during the 7 Years' War and survived his imprisonment, in significant part, by eating potatoes, the same potatoes that the French medical establishment had formally condemned as a cause of leprosy 30 years earlier. He came home convinced that the potato could feed France. He spent the rest of his life proving it. His methods were not scientific papers, not theological arguments, not confrontations with the medical faculty that had issued the 1630 opinion. His method was theatre. He obtained a plot of land outside Paris and planted it with potatoes. Then he arranged for the king, Louis XVI, who had been persuaded to support the project, to wear a potato flower in his buttonhole at the royal court. Marie Antoinette wore potato flowers in her hair. When the Parisian court wore potato flowers as fashion accessories, the symbolic valence of the potato changed overnight. The food of peasants and prisoners and the theologically suspicious became the food of royalty. Then Parmentier arranged for the potato field to be guarded by soldiers during the day and unguarded at night, deliberately, conspicuously. The Parisian public, observing soldiers guarding a field, drew the obvious conclusion: whatever was in that field was worth stealing. They stole the potatoes. They planted them. They ate them. They did not die of leprosy. They did not develop syphilis or moral corruption, or any of the symptoms the theologians and physicians had warned them about for 200 years. They discovered that potatoes were filling, versatile, cheap to grow, storable across winter, and capable of producing more calories per acre than any grain crop available in European agriculture. The rehabilitation that 2 centuries of evidence had failed to accomplish took approximately 1 growing season, once the framing shifted from dangerous to desirable. What followed the potato's acceptance in European agriculture was one of the most dramatic demographic events in modern history. Between 1700 and 1900, the population of Europe approximately tripled, from roughly 100 million to over 400 million people. Historians of agriculture and demography attribute a significant portion of this growth directly to the potato. The caloric arithmetic is straightforward. An acre of land planted with potatoes produces roughly 3 times the calories of an acre planted with wheat. Those calories are also more nutritionally complete. The potato contains significant quantities of vitamin C, potassium, and B vitamins that grain crops do not provide in comparable amounts. A person subsisting primarily on potatoes, as the Irish peasant population discovered in the 18th and early 19th centuries, can survive in reasonable health on a diet that would produce severe malnutrition if built around grain alone. The same crop that produced the Irish population explosion also produced, when the Blight came in 1845, the Irish famine, a catastrophe that killed approximately 1 million people and drove another million into emigration in a single decade. The potato that had saved European populations from the chronic caloric deficit of the pre-modern world had, in Ireland, become the single point of failure for a population that had become entirely dependent on it. The devil's apple, the banned vegetable, the crop that caused leprosy and syphilis, and moral corruption, and spiritual contamination. It fed a continent, and when it failed, it broke a nation. Frederick the Great's soldiers, standing around the Kolberg potato field in 1774, were not protecting a vegetable. They were protecting an idea, the idea that the thing in the ground was valuable, was worth guarding, was something that the people looking at the soldiers should want badly enough to overcome 2 centuries of institutional instruction, telling them it would kill them. The peasants who crept into that field at night and stole the potatoes were not making an agricultural decision. They were making a decision about which authority to believe, the soldiers whose behavior implied value, or the clergy and physicians whose words implied danger. They chose the soldiers. They were right. The potato did not arrive in Europe as a miracle. It arrived as a botanical specimen from a conquered civilization, classified immediately as dangerous by every institution with the authority to classify things, and excluded from the European diet for 2 centuries by a consensus so complete and so wrong that it constitutes one of the most expensive institutional errors in the history of agriculture. The calories that were not eaten during those 2 centuries, the famines that could have been less severe, the populations that did not grow because the food that could have sustained them was sitting in the ground of a continent that had decided, on the basis of nightshade taxonomy and biblical omission and humoral theory, that it was the devil's. 2 monks smuggled silkworm eggs in a bamboo staff. A pharmacist planted a guarded field. A king wore a flower in his buttonhole. The most consequential agricultural revolution in European history was accomplished not by science, not by reason, not by the careful dismantling of institutional error. It was accomplished by making people want to steal something. Because wanting to steal something is older and more powerful than any institutional authority that ever told you not.